And when I was writing the miniseries, there was a scene in the miniseries between one of the Cylons, who we call Number 6, and a character named Baltar. And he was talking with her about something in the scene, and as I was writing it, I just had her say, "God is love." And I literally stopped, because I was struck by it was an interesting thing for a robot to say. And I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't really have an understanding of what larger place this could go, but I really liked it because it just wasn't something I was used to seeing in science fiction when you're dealing with androids or robots, so I kept it. But it was just a small reference in the show. I turned in the first draft to the studio and the network, and I got back a note from a network executive at the time named Michael Jackson, no relation, who fixed on that line and said, well, that's a really interesting thing for a robot to say, and said that there were a lot of parallels and allegories in the script already to the war against terrorism and Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 event. And he said, what if you took that further and really made the Cylons gave them more of a religious fanaticism, gave them a fundamentalism as driving their reason to wipe out humanity? And I grabbed that because you're not used to getting that kind of a note from a network executive. And I said, sure, I can do that. And so from that point on, the show took a fundamental turn where that became part of our myth. And so I sort of developed this idea that the Cylons had, as their development grew of their own sort of, their beings and what it meant to be sentient and self-aware and to be a thinking person, they developed a theology, that they developed an idea in one true God that spoke to them and was a God of love, and that essentially, in their view, looked upon the Cylons as the next step in evolution, that their God had created man, man was a flawed creation, man creates Cylon, Cylon is a more perfect creation, the Cylons need to destroy the old bad creation to fulfill God's plan. And that was essentially sort of what the Cylons were about. And then as I was doing that, I realized that I had another opportunity with the human characters in the show, that the human characters in the show already were using names taken from the Zodiac. They were already using a lot of terminology that was rooted in various Greco-Roman myths. And I decided, well, it'd be really interesting if the colonials, the human characters in the show, were polytheistic, if they believed in multiple gods, and sort of roughly analogous to the Greek and Roman traditions. And that this was now a show about the clash of these two civilizations, that there was a pattern of history that we could play, that the one God comes and drives out the many gods, and that I did some basic preliminary research and very just sort of the way TV writers do, you do it very quickly and sort of skim over things. And one of the things that I was sort of struck by was sort of an idea that monotheism had a certain absolutist point of view, that it tended towards the idea that there is an absolute right and an absolute wrong, and then that sort of notion of thinking can easily flash into intolerance and flash into fundamentalism and a belief in absolutism, and that the polytheistic culture by its very nature would believe many different things, have many different gods and many different practices, and that they on some level would be more tolerant but also more vulnerable to division and more apt to sort of fight amongst themselves. And that sort of formed the basic superstructure of the show. And ever since then, the show has bit by bit become more and more and more about the sort of religious clash between these two civilizations, and also tapping into the idea that maybe there is a larger story going on, that the two sides are actually both wrong on some level and both right on some level. And that there are continually references in the show that there are certain characters we pick out that seem to have a larger awareness of what's going on, and they start saying things like you'll see in the episode we'll show you today. There's a recurrent line about all this has happened before and all of it will happen again, which is actually a line I stole from Peter Pan. So it's in the Disney animated version of Peter Pan. I think it's Sebastian Cabot who's the narrator. It's his opening line, if I recall. He says, now all of this has happened before and all of it will happen again, but it so happened this time in London, and so on, da-da-da-da. And it's a great line, and I used it because I thought there was something, as we were thinking about the story and what does the story mean, and what does it mean that there's this commonality between our experience on Earth and this fictional story of these people that live countless light years away that are trying to find Earth. and what's the relationship between the two, and why do they wear suits and ties on Galactica, and why do they use a lot of the same names that we do? Why do they speak English? You know, what are we saying in the science fiction terms? Why aren't they bizarrely alien? And I started to move towards this idea of, well, all of this has happened before, and all of it will happen again, and that there's an eternal sort of cycle of time that you'll see us reference, I think, in this episode, that there's a beginning and an ending that sort of continually creates and destroys these civilizations over and over again into some larger goal. And essentially, those are the religious roots of the show. The episode that you're going to watch today is called Flesh and Bone. This is from the first season of Galactica. It's about the 7th or 8th episode in, something like that. To give you some background on what it is, there's a character, one of the principal characters here, his name is Starbuck. Starbuck is the rogue pilot in the show. She was not a woman in the original series. It was a male character played by Dirk Benedict. And one of the first things I wanted to do when I was approaching Galactica the series was, well, what do you do with the fighter pilots? The old show was all about these two guys. One was a rogue, devil-may-care, gambler, womanizer, drinker, hotshot pilot who always, you know, came through in the clinch, and his straight arrow buddy. And it was a team that I had seen before and wasn't really interested in redoing. And one of the first things that occurred to me was, well, what if Starbuck's a woman? And that sort of upended what the show was and your expectations of what the show was. So that's why Starbuck is a woman. She is very much, the simple description of the character is still the same. Hard drinking, gambler, hotshot, mouthy, doesn't like authority, best pilot in the fleet. And in our world, since we were sort of taking everything a little bit more seriously, Starbuck's a very screwed up character. You know, I mean, that's the description of somebody with problems. At this point in the series, which is soon after the attack on the colonies, the fleet is out amongst themselves. The knowledge that the Cylons look like people is relatively new to everybody. They're still getting used to the idea that a Cylon could be anybody in a room. And there's a prisoner who is captured in this episode who is a Cylon, and the show is essentially about Starbuck interrogating him and trying to get information from him. And while she's doing so, he starts talking about faith and about God and gods and truth and what's really happening in the universe. And it gets into some, you know, odd metaphysical areas, and that's why I thought it would be a good one for the show.
Thank you.
Okay.